Hello, everybody. Great to see you all. And I think we're going to have one terrific program today, which uh, be quite provocative and informative. Uh, this is our seventh Norma and Milton Mann annual lecture. It's underwritten by the Mann family foundation uh, in by the daughters in their family's memory and their parents' memory. The lecture series has a focus on education. Last year, for example, Alan Cooperman, Director of Religion Research with the Pew Research Institute, spoke about anti-Semitism, titled Can the Jews Be the Most Loved and Hated Religious Group in America? And certainly what we've seen recently, we can all wonder and question what's going on, not only here, but around the world. All the speakers of the lecture series have been outstanding. Can't wait to hear Georgia Hunter's story. I don't know how many of you have read her book. I have not completed it, but I read part of it and really enthralled by the story. I also want to thank you for your support of the Jewish Historical Society. Obviously, every organization that's like ours certainly can use donations wherever you can find a way to do it. And we very much appreciate anything you can do to support our organization. We just recently celebrated our 40th year, and a couple of couples who are here tonight are the ones who were honored, the Golovs and the Kaplans. Alyssa's not here, but David is, and Fred and Sandy Golov are here. If you could raise your hands, we can all see you. And congratulations on the 40th anniversary celebration. To your left, you'll see an exhibit there called It Happened Here. It's a traveling exhibit and is essentially come out of our archives about the history and the people who are in that history. And if you have a chance to look around, that exhibit has been all over town. And in fact, we are now in a process of going through an ability to, with a Zoom, actually those pictures will come to life and it'll tell the story. That's in process now. Can't tell you when it's going to be completed, but when it is, we'll certainly let you know. So, there's so many people to thank in terms of the credit they deserve in making all this happen. And but I first want to thank Ava Weller, who is our chair of these exhibits, has done this since 2017. Ava, thank you very much for everything. And it does take a team. It takes a team to make things happen. And we're an all-volunteer organization, and we have a terrific bunch of people. For one, your lunch today was usually catered by Marcy Schoenfeld, and she's been under the weather, and she actually told us what we needed to do to get the brunch together. Marcy, if you could raise your hand so people could see you. Then Deborah, Emery, and Eileen, raise your hands. They're the ones that are responsible for the various exhibits that are being shown here, and they took it directly out of our archives. I think you can all realize that it's no small effort to bring all that stuff here. The other part is that it's got to go back. It's one of those things we need to do. But there are a whole bunch of other people, and I'll mention their names because they deserve to be mentioned. Leah Tillman, Seema Broza, who's not here today, Shelley, Gail, Goldie, Goldie and Shelley, who were at the front desk, Gail, Jill, Kaplan, where are you? Okay. Carol, my wife, Seema, Sandy, and Julie. So these are just a few of people who have helped make this event happen today and helps the engine run on a daily and yearly basis. But today is also a very important day. And it's veteran the celebration of Veterans Day tomorrow, but the parade is today. And please raise your hand if you're a veteran. And thank you very much for serving. And please know that the Jewish Historical Society does, in fact, have recordings of many veterans from our community. And if you go onto our website, many of those recordings are there. And thank you very much for your service. I'd like now to pass this over to Ava. And thanks again, Ava.
Thanks so much for being here and for choosing to be with us today for the Norma and Milton Mann annual lecture, which honors the enormous legacy that Norma and Milton Mann left to our community. Pamela and Madeline, Norma and Milton's daughters, through the Mann Family Foundation, continue their parents' commitment to social justice by sponsoring educational events like this that highlight the issues of human rights and prejudice around the world. Please take a few minutes to review the brochure where we recognize our supporters and donors and learn more about the Manns. We thank them for supporting the Jewish Historical Society so we can bring experts and important information and stories to the community. There will be a Q&A afterwards, so please wait until you get the mic. We have people who will hand you a mic so you can ask your question. And if you brought a book to sign, we will have a spot here where Georgia will be happy to sign your book and answer some additional questions. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Georgia Hunter, best-selling author of We Were the Lucky Ones and co-executive producer of the 8-part series based on her family's true Holocaust story, now streaming on Hulu and Disney+. The Kirk family story comes alive through Georgia's gifted storytelling skills in the novel and on screen. Today, Georgia, as family historian, will present the story behind the story, the illustrated backstory about her amazing journey to unearth her family's history, revealing the extraordinary discoveries she made along the way, not only about her ancestors, but about her own identity and the resilience of the human spirit. And with that,
thank you so much, Ava. Thank you to the Historical Society for putting this event on, to Bethel for hosting, and to the friends who are here today, and to all of you, and special nod to my mom, Isabel, who's here, Addie's middle child, if you read the book. I feel like this project has been a part of my life for so long now. I think it's 16 years ago when I started working on the book. It was about a 9-year process, and then the series was several years in the making. So I'm excited to kind of walk you through that journey and, yes, answer any questions that you might have, and sign your book if you brought one. And if you didn't, I have some book plates too. So don't be shy. Come get one of those if you want to put it in your book at home. But first, let's go back in time to 1979. This is a photograph of me with my grandfather, Addie. Can I pull this out? Is that okay? I grew up about a mile from my grandparents. I knew my grandfather, Addie, who you meet in chapter 1 of the book, as Eddie. He had Americanized his name by the time I knew him. He had changed his last name from Kurc, Courts, which is the way it's pronounced in Polish, to Courts, so similar pronunciation in English. And my grandmother, Caroline. We were very, very close. Spent a lot of time together in each other's homes, holidays, birthdays, and such. And yet, my grandfather rarely spoke about his Holocaust era past. It simply wasn't a part of our dialogue. I really don't think it was any sort of deep, dark secret that he was intentionally keeping from me. I was an only child. I had a lot of things going on as a little kid, like friends and sports and boyfriends and all the normal things. And he was also a very charismatic and forward-thinking and positive guy. So it never came up in our conversations. He got sick when I was about 11 and passed away when I was 14. And then at 15, a high school English teacher assigned us a project called an iSearch and said, go out and interview a relative to learn a little bit about your ancestry and in turn about yourself. And so with my grandfather's memory so fresh, I decided to sit down with my grandmother, Caroline, and it was over the course of that hour that my grandfather's story came to light. This is the paper that I wrote about it. I called it Papa's Gift. And my grandmother, sweet Caroline, was able to tell me a little bit about his story and about how he was the only one of his relatives living in France at the start of the war. The rest were in Poland. About how he managed to get out of Europe on a ship from Marseille that was meant to arrive in Brazil. She mentioned that he actually met a young Czechoslovakian woman on that ship, and they were engaged to be married. Lucky for me and my mom, that didn't work out between the two of them. And she said when he finally made it to Brazil, he lost complete touch with his family back in Poland for the duration of the war. And I said, well, how did the family back in Poland survive? I knew enough in my Holocaust studies that the odds were severely against them. And she said, like your grandfather, they rarely spoke about that time. She had met them after the war as well. So I had a lot of questions and a lot of curiosity, and I'd have to wait about 6 years for some answers. And that came at a family reunion that my mother hosted at our home in Massachusetts. My mom's here on the right. I don't know if that's going to work. In the white collared shirt, and next to her with the white cardigan around her shoulders is Felicia. So if you read the book, Felicia is a baby at the start of the story, at the start of the war. My grandmother Caroline in the middle with my father to her left, and then a scattering of cousins of many generations. I think at our peak we were 32 in all. My mom is one of 10 first cousins of that second generation. She invited them. They flew in from France and Israel, from Colombia, Brazil, both coasts of the United States, and we had this incredible week together. A lot of laughter, a lot of different kinds of music, different kinds of food being prepared, lots of languages being spoken. And one night of that reunion, I found myself around a picnic table with my mother and her cousins, and they were telling stories about the war, about their parents. And they were unlike any stories I'd ever heard before. Jose talked about how he was born in Siberia in March, in the middle of the winter, in the Gulag, and how his mother said he was, as a baby, it was so cold that he'd wake with his eyes frozen shut, and she would use her breast milk to coax them open. Anna talked about how her mother, Helena, hiked over the Austrian Alps to safety after the war while pregnant. I heard about false IDs and an escape, a mother-daughter escape from a ghetto, a disguised circumcision. Like, the stories kept coming, and my mind was blown. And I remember thinking, how am I just hearing these now? And someone needs to write these down. And I was 21 years old. I just graduated from the University of Virginia. So I can't say when I went to bed that night I knew that someone would be me. But I do think that's when the idea was seeded somewhere deep down. And it kind of percolated until I couldn't ignore it any longer. And that was 8 years later, in 2008, which was when I put a stake in the ground. And I remember telling my mom one day, I was home for like a Christmas break. I was living in Seattle at the time. And I was like, Mom, I think I want to do this. And she had actually collected my grandfather's story, like condolence letters and photographs and documents. And she had put them together into a binder. And she handed me the binder, and it felt like a little bit of a passing of a baton. And she was like, you should go for it. I thought she might say, like, don't quit your day job. Like, that's a really big project. But she was so supportive. I got the complete support of the entire family. And then I set off to do some research. So as you can see, it was a little daunting to put that stake in the ground because the family is very global. And my first step in my research was going to be to talk to as many relatives as I possibly could, and they lived all over the world. So my first stop was to Paris to visit with Felicia. She has recently passed. It was just her birthday yesterday, right? She was the only living member with firsthand memories of the war. Super important for me to sit down with her, and I had no idea how able or willing she would be to share her story, and was completely bowled over by how honest she was, and also by what she was able to remember from a very, very young age. So if you read the book or watch the series, a lot of people ask me, did that really happen? Did that really happen? Did Felicia really experience that? And the answer is always yes, which is heartbreaking. But I was so grateful for her honesty and for the time that we spent together. Another stop on my research travels was to Brazil to visit with my grandfather's brother Gennick's children. So here I am with one of Gennick's sons, Michel, at the archives, National Archives. And then the picture on the left is actually of a bay called Guanabara Bay, where my grandfather passed a few stories down to my mom and my mom to me. And one of them was about rowing a boat out into this bay to meet a ship. And that's all I'll say, because that's a pretty big spoiler. And he talked about that and that moment in his life and in his story. And so standing there at the bay and imagining him in one of these rowboats rowing out to greet a ship was pretty amazing. When I ran out of family members to interview, I thought, who else might be out there with a story to share that's relevant? And so, thanks to a long, deep, twisted rabbit hole in the World Wide Web, I found the ex-fiancée, the Czechoslovakian woman who my grandfather met, Eliska. And I wrote her a letter, and she called me the day it arrived. And I wasn't sure. She was 88 years old. I wasn't sure, again, where she would be, if she would remember my grandfather or want to talk with me. And she said, of course I remember your grandfather. Please come down and visit me. And so my mom and I flew down to North Carolina, and we spent 2 days with her. And it was amazing being able to sit with her and chat with her and hear her stories about what it was like to be a refugee with a one-way ticket on this boat called the Alcina, which was full of musicians and artists and lots of people who were illegally issued visas, like she and my grandfather, I discovered, were. And then how that ship got stopped in Dakar, and it got stopped in Morocco, and finally stopped again. The passengers were finally let off in Brazil, but put in prison before they were finally able to walk on free soil. And so hearing it through her eyes and that very human lens was incredible. She had some really great photographs, like this one of her about the age which she met my grandfather. She also had one of my favorite things was a leather-bound book. And when my grandfather first got to Brazil, he had to work under the table until his work permit cleared. And so he made books. He bound leather books by hand, and she had one of his hand-bound leather books that she gave us. So it was an incredible experience. Also, so grateful for her time. So along with my oral histories, as many interviews as I could conduct, I was also sort of in parallel reaching out to any sort of organization, museum, registrar, that might have an archive that might have a relevant record. So that often meant hiring translators to pen letters in Russian and German and French and Polish. And sure enough, letters would come back to me. Results would come back to me. This one was from a ministry in Moscow, and it came back 11 months later, but it had record of it had record of Gennick, my grandfather's brother, being in a certain place at a certain time. And so I started a timeline because I realized this is going to be a lot to keep track of. There are 5 siblings, and they all scattered, right, at the start of the war. Even the family in Poland, they all had their own paths to survival. So even it was just this little nugget of like a person and a place, I would drop that into my timeline. This is likely illegible to everybody, but it was a huge discovery thanks to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University that had access to a 9-page handwritten document of my great uncle Gennick's explaining everything about his Siberian chapter, which was very vague going into my research. His sons just knew he was sent there, one of them was born there, and then eventually he joined the army. So this document explains everything, why he was arrested, the day he was arrested, how he and his wife rode the train for 45 days before they were let out at this camp called Altynai in northeastern Siberia, what they were made to do there, and eventually why they were released on amnesty and then basically forced to join the army. And because he joined the army, thanks to the fact that the Polish army fell under the wing of the British army, the UK Ministry of Defense had all their military records. So I was able to track where they fought and found some incredible battles that they were a part of, including this one called the Battle of Monte Cassino, which was very pivotal at the end of the war and sort of turning the tides towards Allied victory, and specifically for the Polish army. And I also discovered that a couple of relatives had unclaimed medals of honor, so I was able to claim those and pass those along. I was also, of course, asking family members, like, do you have any records, any photographs, anything from the time? And so, granted, they were on the run. They rarely stopped moving, so they didn't have a lot. Everything they carried was on them. But we had a few things. And so if I had, say, like this photograph of my grandfather, who spent a short time in a Polish column of the French army before he left France, or his sheet music. He was a composer. I don't know if you heard the music playing earlier. That was his music. And he had one piece called List, which means letter in Polish, that was played over the radio and made him like a little bit famous before the war started. So if I had a piece of music, a photograph, you could bet that this was going to show up verbatim in my book. I love this document. This is my great aunt Helena, who is the youngest of the 5 siblings, and this is her false ID. You can see she chose the name Brzoza for her surname, which means birch tree in Polish. And you can't quite tell from the image, but she did have the fairest hair, the fairest eyes, and passed the easiest for Aryan. So she used this ID on many, many occasions. And I love her story because she really started as like the baby of the family and had to evolve into the orchestrator of the family's safety in so many ways over and over again, having to bribe a husband out of jail or move her parents to a safe house in the country. I just love her expression in this photograph, and it matches all the descriptions of the Helena. I did have a chance to meet Helena when I was very young, but everyone described her as this kind of badass, stubborn, will never say no, she gets whatever she wants personality, and I love that this picture kind of captures that. I had this photo of Genik and his wife Herta. Genik's in his army attire. He's in Tel Aviv and getting ready to go off and fight in Italy. And I love this photo, which will come back around when we talk about the television series a little bit, but this was taken by my great-uncle Jacob, who was a photographer by trade. After the war, Bella is there holding baby Victor, and they're about to head into Germany to a displaced persons camp where they're hoping they can acquire visas to eventually move to the States. And again, I just love this photo, how sort of after everything they've been through, considering their stepping into a train car, which we all know how many people lost their lives, transported to the camps in these cars, and how the pride and the way that they're carrying themselves and this little new life in Bella's arms. I just love this photo so much. The third bucket of my research was to travel in the footsteps of the family members in Europe. So after they left Poland and decided to reunite in Italy and then in Brazil, they never went back to Radom, the town where they were from in central Poland. They had no interest in moving home. And, I wish I could ask them why. I can kind of imagine. There was still rampant anti-Semitism. People were being killed in the streets. And the town itself, which was once home to over 30,000 Jews who made up about a third of the population. After the war, there were fewer than 300. So I had this very dark and sort of haunted feeling of what this town would feel like, but I also knew I really wanted to go and walk in the footsteps of my ancestors and see the place where my grandfather grew up. So this is an image of the ghetto gates that were erected when the Germans came in at the start of the war, and I knew the family had been confined to the ghetto. And this is the same street corner as it looks today. And you can see just my first impression was how beautiful it was, how livable this town felt. It had cobblestone streets and wrought iron balconies and beautiful street lamps and thriving businesses and flowers, and people were nice. And I just remember feeling like, okay, for the first time in a very long time, I can imagine what life was like for them before everything got turned upside down. This is me at the entrance to their old apartment. They lived on the second floor, and I did a lot of time walking in and out and in and out and in and out of this arched entranceway. We had a wonderful guide, Jacob, and he took us around and told us about the Jewish history of the town, how there used to be a synagogue, which I knew my family would have attended, and now it's an empty square. Because he explained that when the Germans came in, they first used it as a barn for their horses and then burned it down. So today they left the square empty, which I really appreciate. They actually have a memorial to the Jewish population now in the square. He also really wanted to show me the Jewish cemetery outside of town, and this I found an actual postcard of what it used to look like. So the fact that a postcard even exists of it, you can imagine how much pride there was, how many headstones, how well kept it was. And today, sadly, this is what it looks like. And once again, Jacob explained that when the Germans came in, they ripped up the headstones to build an airstrip outside of town. So I had a very double experience, sort of this like eye-opening, what was life before, understanding, as well as this very sort of like chilling, haunting, kind of feeling the ghosts of the past all around me. But I'm so glad I went. I went with my husband on that trip, and we traveled all through Eastern Europe, trying to follow in the family's footsteps. And then the following summer, we took our son Wyatt back, and he was 4 at the time. We have Wyatt's friend here, Julian, our youngest attendee. Thank you for coming, buddy. So this is what Wyatt looked like when he was 4. like a little bit like Ransom, right? And this, we followed the Adriatic coast down the coast of Italy, and it was a little bit less research intense, but we did make some really important stops, including a train station in Bari in Puglia, the southern region, where there was a family reunion of sorts. And it was really beautiful to be there with Wyatt and to hear the chirp of Italian on the speakers and to see the trains coming and going and to hold his hand and to imagine Mila there with Felicia, her little girl, who would have been just a little bit older than Wyatt at the time. And so I'm so glad. I don't know how much he remembers aside from the gelato on that trip, but I'm so glad that he came with us. The book came out in 2017 on Valentine's Day, and I put a nice note out to my family just thanking them profusely for all of the help that I had received from them in bringing this book to life. And I told them that Penguin, my publisher, was going to send me on a little mini book tour, and I was going to have an event, my first at a Barnes & Noble in the city, and how cool, like, thank you so much, thank you. And then the next thing I know, 23 of them are flying in for the event. So they all came, thank God, because they were like the only ones there. And they all sat in the audience, and of all 5 siblings, 4 were represented that night by children and grandchildren. And it was an incredible evening. So this is like the day after at my house. They all came for breakfast, and we had a beautiful time together. And it just kind of just shows, a lot of people say, like, well, is your family happy with it? And to be honest, like, there was not an audience I cared more about. I love any reader that reads my book. I'm still in awe of the fact that people have my family story in their hands. But what meant the most to me was for the family to appreciate it and feel like I did it justice. And thank God the support was overwhelming, and they all seemed so thrilled with the way it turned out. So we had a little mini celebration in 2017. My next son was born just a few days after my book tour. Took a little hiatus, and then about a year later, a dear friend called, Tommy, and he said, hey, pal, how would you like to, Tommy, I should reference, Tommy is a camp friend of my husband. So Robert met him when they were maybe like 11 and 13. I met him maybe at 19, so I've now known him for over 25 years. He has been a really fun friend to sort of cheer for in his work life, because he started in the arts, and well, actually he thought he was going to be a lawyer and then realized he was an artist at heart, and he started making these like plays in church basements in the city, and we'd go, we'd cheer, and then all of a sudden he's directing the musical Hamilton and Fosse Verdon, the television show with Michelle Williams, who he later married, now has 2 children with. So Tommy's been amazing, and he called and he said, hey, pal, how would you like to try to partner up and bring your story to life on the screen? I can't stop thinking about it. He had also been involved from literally day one of when I started researching this story. So he was involved with my journey. He was actually the moderator of my first Barnes & Noble talk. We sat next to each other and chatted for that evening. And so when he put that invitation out, there was something in me that was a little bit nervous to allow this story to be taken to a screen. Just I didn't want it to be exploited in any way. I knew I would just need to trust deeply whoever like took it on. And so it was just a very quick and obvious yes. That feels like a dream come true. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and tell you just a quick, like the quick and dirty of how a television series is made and what it meant to me to bring this story to life. The first thing we did was we put together a pitch, right? So like to take out to the networks, and we did that, I think, in 2019. We worked forever on it in 2019, took it out. No one said yes. Okay, if it ends there, amazing. I got to go to like Netflix headquarters in LA. How cool is that? And it was me along with a showrunner, Erica Lopez, who wrote the pitch and did most of the talking, and Tommy in the room. And then we pitched it one more time about a year later during COVID on Zoom. And I thought, well, this is never going to work. There's no personal connection. But we were actually able to present a lot of the images I've shown you here and kind of dive a little deeper into sort of the visuals. And then maybe there was something about the fact that we were all separated and isolated and a little scared and could relate to in a tiny way to what this family had experienced. And for whatever reason, Hulu picked it up and said, we'd like to do this. So the first thing you do in writing a television series is you put together what's called a writer's room, and some are in person, and we were obviously on Zoom because of COVID still. So here are our top 2 rows of writers. We had 6 incredible writers. Erica's the top middle, our showrunner. We had a researcher, note taker, assistant. And we met every day together for 5 months, for 5 hours a day on Zoom, with our mission of taking 400 pages of written content and adapting it into 8 hours of visual content. And I felt like Tommy and Erica from the very beginning had said, "Now, Georgia, like this is your passion project. If you'd like to be involved, you can be. You can step back. You can, how involved would you like to be?" And I said, every step of the way. So I got to be in this room every minute that they were together. We had the most incredible research drive that we pulled all of everything that I had done, along with photographs, and we had Showa interviews and audio and visuals, and we kind of took that and multiplied it by 10. Our researcher made this incredible drive. So whenever a writer was working on an episode, they could look up a specific character, relative, or an event and dive deeply into the backstory. We were also, this was pretty surreal, putting together a cast. So starting to put actors, faces to these tips of mine. We ended up with an entirely Jewish cast, which I'm really proud of. All except for my grandmother Caroline, who was not Jewish in real life, but everyone in real life who was. We have about a third Israeli, a third British, and a third American for our ensemble, who you see here. Meanwhile, as we got closer to our shooting date, our teams were hard at work putting together the world that the Courts family would live in, which included costumes and sets. So here is an early rendering of our set designer, James's, who put together for the apartment. So he'd read the book, he read the script, and they would also rely on a lot of kind of photos from the period for inspiration. So you can see he's drawn here to the ceiling molding for the dining room, which was a really important place, right, where many meals were taken around a table. And Tommy likes to sum up our show and the whole story as this is really a story about a family that just wants to come together around the dinner table again, right? You meet them, you see them at the first Passover. The next Passover, Addie can't be there. He's stuck in France, and then it's like they're on the run for their lives, right? So they just want to come back together. So the dining room was super important, and so he was drawing inspiration from these photos, the warmth of the walls, the crystal. And this next photo is from my first day on set, walking through the apartment for the first time with the cast, and this is what it looked like. If you watch the series, this is the table where they all come together. And I was just in awe of the attention to detail and how every single little fork, place setting, molding, clock was intentionally put into a place to make it feel like this home that the family would have lived in. We did a lot of shooting in a studio. We shot mostly in Bucharest, Romania, in studios. So here we have a picture of the Alcina, the ship that my grandfather took from Marseille. And again, our set designer was really drawn in this particular case to the stained glass ceiling in the music lounge. My mom came over, it was I think March maybe, when they were shooting, and the Alcina was being built. So this is the early stages of what the ship looked like. And then I think it was like 2 weeks later, it was maybe even a week later. It's amazing how quickly they had to work. This is what it looked like, the finished set. We have Logan, who plays my grandfather, Leahy, who plays Eliska during a scene in the music lounge. The other kind of set where we shot was called a back lot, and that's basically like a block worth of exteriors, and that could be, depending on what angle you were shooting from or which part of the back lot, it could be a different city. It could be Warsaw or Lodz or Radom, and then with VFX they were able to add some heights, so with Warsaw the buildings looked a little bit bigger, but again I figured, okay, these are like exteriors, it probably won't be as detailed, but you can see literally like every stone was laid underfoot, every street sign was weathered. You'd look in the windows of the street signs, you'd see the things that were for sale in that shop. Most people probably, you won't even see it in the series, but just for the authenticity factor, once again, the details were just incredible. We shot this cool Bari train station in an old warehouse, which we turned into a train station. And in this one of the things I loved was our director of photography, Tim, really drawn to this lighting. He's like, I love the way this light is coming through these windows. Let's try to recreate that. So on the day of shooting, he recreated that with some beautiful lighting on our set. And then sort of the third bucket of location was shooting outdoors on location. So this was a scene from my great aunt Helena, who was sent off to work in a beet field at the start of the war. So we found a beet field, and they actually like planted specifically beets for her to pull up. And here's Joey King, who plays Helena during a scene in the beet field. And here she is again with our Belle, who played Felicia. We had many Felicias, right? Baby age, 3.5, 7 and up. So this is Belle, and this is actually at the last little bit of our shooting, we moved over to southern Spain, where we shot like anything that was on the coast or in the mountains. So this is a mountain range in southern Spain called El Torcal, where we shot the Austrian Alps. You can see we shot in all sorts of weather, which was interesting. Genik and Herta and Tel Aviv on top here, and then the island off of Rio, where Addie and Eliska were confined before finally getting their visas approved. And one of the things I love about these visuals, which I tried to paint in words in my book, but it's so vivid when you can see them across the screen, is just how varied they are, and such a colorful way of really explaining and describing how far and wide this family traveled in order to survive. And I think it's one of the things that makes their story a little bit different, and just the geography of where they went, like from coasts to mountains. Here we have my grandfather in Casablanca during a short stint, and then this cool shot of Genik from above, taken by drone during his time in the army in Italy. And then I'll just wrap with a few pictures that are just a big nod to the production team for their commitment to authenticity. I think we shared that mission when I was trying to unearth the story as the granddaughter. My mission was to tell it with as much authenticity as possible, to share the story truthfully. So I didn't make anything up, like I wasn't about to make up a character or an event. I wanted to tell it as truthfully as I could. And I also wanted to tell it in a way that my kids could eventually pick it up and relate to it. So kind of to peel back those sepia tones or that lens of history and make it feel modern and relevant. And the whole production really took that to heart. And that was the mission that they carried with them as well, which I heard over and over again, from whether it was like a makeup artist or the person who took pictures of moving vehicles. I mean, you name a position, and there was one for somebody on set, and everybody came up to me at some point when I was there telling me, thank you for bringing this story to us. This is why we make television, and we just want to do it justice. So it meant so much to me to hear that, and then to see it and to watch that mission kind of being fulfilled. So here is the picture that my great uncle Jacob took from the train, and the one we recreated for the series. This is Felicia in the convent. She's ended up hiding in a convent for a pretty long stint, actually. And I had discovered that she had some wartime clothing that was donated to Yad Vashem in Israel after the war that her mother donated. So I had a friend going, and he took pictures of it for me, and I sent those to our costume designer. So she recreated these replicas of Felicia's wartime clothing that our Belle wore. We also had this fun picture of my grandparents on their wedding day, Addie and Caroline, that somehow surfaced a little bit later in the game, and I sent them to Lisa, our costume designer, just a few days before our wedding day shoot. And she scrapped all of her original ideas for costumes and had these identical replicas made for Nicole and Logan, who played my grandparents on their wedding day. The whole experience was quite surreal, watching this thing that I'd only imagined in my head come to life on a screen, like visually being there, like even just like walking through the apartment, feeling like I was stepping back in time. But it became extra surreal when my family would come to visit me on the set. So my mom was there on a couple of occasions. My boys came over too, which was really fun. Here we have relatives from France and Israel who came in for our stint in Spain, and sort of seeing it through their eyes, one generation closer, especially like my mom's generation, was quite wild, because I didn't get used to ever the fact that this was my family story coming to the screen and like become numb to it. But you do, after 123 days of shooting, like it becomes partly work, right? I cried a lot, like throughout. It was a very emotional process, but seeing Anna meet her set parents on the mountains in Spain. It was just wild. We also had a really fun day where we had a cameo. So if you watch the series, we're in episode 8 in the finale, and if you blink, you'll miss it. We wanted to be in an action scene so that our boys, who are, I guess they were probably like 6 and 12 at the time, 6 and 11, didn't get bored. Because one thing I've learned about making television is that the days are very, very long. I mean, you take a million takes for a 10-second shot. But we were in a scene with my grandfather, who was played by Logan, and it's a scene where he's running down the street, and there's a family of 4 walking, minding their own business, walking in the other direction, and he busts his way right through the middle of us. So this is the still from our little moment on set, which was really fun. The boys had a blast and took it very, very seriously. But even more special to me, at least, was the fact that we convinced my mom to have a cameo the next day. And she was also in a scene with her father, Logan, who plays Addie. And here she is getting her hair and makeup done, and with Nicole, who plays her mom, on set on the day of our shoot. And one of the things that I loved about, again, the authenticity, anytime we had like my grandfather had a snakeskin wallet, so I'd take a picture of it and send the dimensions, and the props team would make a replica for Logan to carry in his pocket. Nahuma had some jewelry, including a brooch, a silver brooch. So again, I took pictures, I told them exactly what it looked like, and they had one recreated for Robin Weigart, who played Nahuma for the series, that she wore throughout. But for this scene that my mom was in, I brought the real one, and I put it on her like right before she went on, so it felt like Nahuma was there with us. It was so if you see my mom, which you will, my mom actually gets a lot of airtime. And this is also, I'm going to end on this picture, probably one of my favorite photographs. So her scene was with my grandfather when he's about to jump into that rowboat. He's out at a pier in Rio waiting for a ship to come in. And the way they do it with when you have a whole bunch of extras, which they call background actors, is they get all the background actors set up first, and then they bring the main cast on. So they had my mom and all the others kind of getting set up and getting everything perfect. And then Logan walks onto the set, and I'm like this far from them. The cameras are like right here, and I watch Logan, and I see my mom, and then I watch Logan turn around and look at her over his shoulder. It's like his daughter in real life, and he goes, "This is so wild. I have chills." And he rubbed the goosebumps off of his arm, and so I snapped a picture right when he did that. So I'll end on that note. Needless to say, it was a very emotional experience. I am beyond proud of how the series turned out. I think all the effort that we all put into making it as authentic as we could paid off. And sure was an incredible learning experience for me. I'd love to do something like it again if I'm ever so lucky, but it will forever hold a very incredibly special place in my heart. Both experiences, the writing of the book and then the making of the show. Again, I think I got very, very lucky in that I worked with the most incredible teams of people who shared my passion for this story and for bringing the truth to life. So thank you for listening. I want to say thank you so much, and I'd love to hear your questions if you have any. Yes.
Why does it say that the book is a novel?
The question is, why does it say the book is a novel? That's a great question. So I did spend 9 years of my life researching it. There's some mics there if you want. I'm also happy to repeat the question if you'd like. And I thought hard about whether to write it as nonfiction, and I actually went down that path first. And so to publish a book as nonfiction versus a novel, it's a very different experience. You have to write for nonfiction what's called a proposal, which requires, it's a whole thing, like an outline with chapter summaries and who is your market and how are you different. So it forced me to sit down and do that, which was great, because if I hadn't written chapter summaries and kind of figured out how I'm going to map this story, which if you read it's a lot of people to follow and a lot of places that they go, it was a really helpful process. In the end, as the manuscript came to life, I found that even though it was all based on truth, where they were and when, it was sort of that like connective tissue that I didn't have. I didn't have access to what they were thinking, feeling, saying, wearing, weather, eating, all the things that I think historical fiction brings to life so beautifully, because you allow yourself that creative license. So my lens was like, could it have happened this way? And of course I did loads of research on what the weather was that day or what brand of cigarettes they would have smoked. Like there was so much research involved, but I did make those details up. And so I think in the end, I just wasn't comfortable. If I had been able to talk to all the relatives firsthand and ask them what they were thinking and feeling and saying, then perhaps I would have called it narrative nonfiction. But in the end, historical fiction felt like a better match for me. Yes.
You spoke earlier about when you visited the town and you walked through the portico of their apartment building. Mm-hmm. Socioeconomically, where did your family fit within the confines of the Jewish population? It seems as if they were well off.
Yeah, they were definitely, I'd say, middle to upper class. They did not live in the old Jewish quarter. They lived in a building where Poles and Jews both lived. They were highly assimilated. So they spoke Polish, they went to schools with Poles and Jews, and they had a very successful fabric business. That's what my great-grandparents did. That they were both very involved, both Saul and Nehuma. So yeah, they were, and I know like growing up, from what I heard, education was paramount, music was paramount. They all learned musical instruments from a very young age and practiced every day. They talked about the things in their house that they were very proud of, like they had a bathtub, and that was a big deal. And of course, a Steinway piano, that was also a big deal. Yeah. And maybe, in real life, maybe it wasn't quite that fancy. I will never know, but certainly, yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Actually, following up on that, I was curious, when you went back to Rob, was there ever an interest in, and I know there's a piece of this in the series, I don't want to spoil it, but did you ever have an interest in trying to gain access to the real apartment?
So I was interested enough to go to the apartment. I was too scared to knock on the door. And there was one cousin who they went back to try to retrieve some things before they left the country, and they were not welcomed. The house was being lived in, and they were not welcomed. So I think that turned a lot of people off. And for me, it scared me off just enough to not knock on that door. I kind of wish I had. But I can't imagine anybody would have any connection at this point, living in that, whoever's living there now, to the family that was there in the early 30s, mid 30s. But yeah, there's a very powerful scene in the show where Nehuma and Saul and Helena go back and just to check to see if there's any mail, because at this point they haven't heard from their children. Nehuma hasn't heard from her kids in 7 or 8 years. Yeah. Yes.
You titled the book, We Are the Lucky Ones. So does that refer to the fact that they are the ones who survive? Or does it refer to the fact that in spite of all the tribulation and challenges, they were able to preserve or grow some special family quality which other families which survived didn't?
That's a good question. I was asking about the title. I think all I can speak to, I think there was so much luck involved in their story. I think they always had a plan, and they were constantly moving. And I think where the luck really came into play was often like that their plans worked, right? There were so many times when a decision was made, I'm going to run for that, or I'm going to try to dig under this fence, or I'm going to try to bribe my husband out of this prison, or where they could have easily, their lives could have been just over. So I think luck was a huge part of it. And I think, I give credit to Felicia for the title. At the family reunion in 2000, when we were all sitting around the table, she looked at the cousins around and my grandmother, and she said, "It's a miracle that we're all here today. We were the lucky ones." And obviously that stayed with me. So I think, I think part of it is what, absolutely, they were lucky to have survived. But I also do think there are so many parts of their story that did depend on who they were on the inside and those traits that I now see so clearly that were passed down to me, even though the stories were not. And the religion, I wasn't brought up in the Jewish faith. My grandfather did not hold on to that piece of his past, or pass it on to his family, at least. I know it meant something to him. And so now, having spent so much time kind of putting myself in his shoes and also the shoes of his relatives and into their hearts and minds, I see so much of these traits of stubbornness and perseverance and resourcefulness and love. Like, there's so much love with this family. I mean, now, since that family reunion, I think we've gotten together every year at least, or every other year, for something, for some reason. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think I'll never know if it's hard to say there are certain traits that made them lucky, but there are definitely traits that I see now that I wouldn't have really understood before I set off to do all this research, that I absolutely associate with who I am, who they are, and also probably attributed to their survival. Yeah. Sorry, I feel like you had a question.
You partially answered my question,
Okay.
But I'm curious about your own identity. Did you know you knew he was Polish, but did you know there was this Jewish connection?
I actually didn't even know he was Polish. I never detected an accent. Often we spoke French around the dinner table, and certainly that was my mother's experience growing up as a child. He was a stickler for my English grammar. I think he probably had a hint of an accent. He spoke 7 languages fluently. He was a true polyglot. So my mom knew growing up that he was Polish and Jewish. And again, maybe it was mentioned to me. And I knew we had family all over. Like, I knew he had cousins in Brazil and cousins in France, or siblings, and sometimes we'd have a cousin from France come stay with us for the summer. But that was my normal. Like, there was no oh, that's strange. Why is that? So I feel like it was just how I knew him, and how I knew the family just was my normal. So I wasn't drawn to ask questions like, why do you have so many family all over Europe, and why is everybody else raised in the Jewish faith? And I wasn't. I just never thought to ask those questions growing up.
Well, you're probably related to most of the people in this room.
Yeah, probably. Yes.
Has the book ever been translated into Polish?
Yes.
Has the series aired there, and what was the reaction?
Such a good question. Do you know if the series is aired in Poland? It's aired all over Europe, all over South America, in Asia. I'll have to look about Poland specifically. I want to say it has, but I have not gotten a reaction yet. I've gotten just the countries that America has received it beautifully. France, Brazil, a lot of the South American countries are just, the people who reach out to me at least are just kind of bowled over by it. But I don't know. Poland, Germany, I don't know what the reaction is there. That's a really good question. Anybody else?
Since you knew your mother was Jewish, did you ever wonder why you didn't have any Jewish parts in your life, in your home? Did you ever ask your mother, why don't we do some Jewish things?
Yeah, no, but my mother was not raised Jewish, so I did not know she was half Jewish. So my grandmother, Caroline, was Presbyterian, and I think she probably would have raised the family Jewish if my grandfather had said, I would like to do this. So I wish I could have asked them and have been a fly on the wall when they had those conversations. And my grandfather's the only one of the five siblings who did not raise his family in the faith, and who married out of the faith as well. But I think, if I were to guess, that he also was the only sibling to land in a place in a foreign country where he was the only Pole and the only Jew. So even his brother, who landed in Chicago, was surrounded by a Jewish community. He did experience anti-Semitism when he got to the States, a bit of it. So I think he likely chose not to put that stamp on his family because he'd seen what it should have done for them, according to statistics, to the odds. But I know it meant a lot to him, so he would go back to Rio and to Sao Paulo, where the family had gathered after the war, and many stayed. And he might not tell my mom or her siblings that he was going for Passover. He might say, I'm going to go in the spring or for my Helena and our shared birthday, but he would be there for Passover. Or he would talk about his mother's challah bread, or he would go to the Jewish deli on the way home and pick out his favorite specialty. So I know it meant something to him, and I think, though, he just chose to pass on his, again, the traits over the religion, which I so now appreciate, and I can see so clearly. Like, it was a quiet passing down of, you're here because of a lot of the things that I experienced, but without outwardly saying so, or without the religious piece of it.
Well, maybe I misunderstood you. I thought you said your mother knew she was Jewish.
My mom knew she grew up. Yeah, when she grew up, she knew that her father had been raised Jewish.
Okay, but she wasn't interested in doing anything.
Do you want to answer this question, Mom?
I don't want to put her on the spot. I know she's here.
I think, as you explained, we did live in an area where we were the only. Well, there were no other Jews in our neighborhood, but more importantly than that, when you think about it, I mean, my sister was born in Brazil in 1946, 1 year after the war ended. I was born 2 years later, and I think what Georgia said is about right. My father just thought it was so recent for him and so tangible, really, and he also was not a religious person himself, and was so excited to assimilate as an American in every way. American jazz, American cinema, American everything. And he just, that was his decision. I'm going to raise my family without fear of oppression. And that, combined with the fact that he wasn't particularly religious, is probably the answer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mom.
I also wonder if the unfortunate association of his original first name, Adolf.
Adio is short for Adolf. Yeah, which clearly he got rid of that.
Yeah.
Yes. Do we have time for one more?
Is there anything about the movie that you would have done that you now regret you did, or you're disappointed in?
No, I can't say so. I wish we had a little bit more time and budget to include every single scene in the book, because those were all real things that happened. I was just talking with Brian before we started about, there's a scene where Helena has to cross a river, and she literally has to swim through a river to catch a basket that's floating away. We couldn't afford or didn't have the logistics to shoot in January in Bucharest under a cold river. Although, to Joey's credit, she and Eva, who plays Bella, said that they will happily jump in a river if we ask. But no, I have no regrets, and so that's a really nice feeling.
I just wanted to ask, since it was accepted to be made into a movie and that was so amazing, who was it that underwrote it?
20th Century Fox, you mean our producer? So Hulu is the streaming service, and 20th Century Fox produced. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The movie, the film is wonderful.
Thank you.
And it does absolutely follow the book. Yeah. It's beautiful. It's very good. You are so close.
Yeah, a lot of people, they like a book, but they don't like the adaptation. And I was a little concerned about that and how we were going to fit, again, like 400 pages of content into 8 hours. It was hard. That was our biggest challenge. So I appreciate that so much.
I got a quick
question on historical research. So a lot of this you did for your family, and a lot of it you did for European organizations. But in terms of anything in America, like in New York, there's a Center for Jewish History, which is pretty substantial. But are there any for other folks here who want to do more of that research? And do you have any advice as well?
Absolutely. And I actually have a page on my website specifically devoted to research tips. So if you go to georgiahunterauthor.com, you'll see on a drop-down menu research tips, and specifically for Jewish roots. The International Tracing Service is great. I've recently added like 5 links because I keep learning. I mean, I'm tempted to do some of my research all over again and see what I find. But I've been introduced to so many wonderful organizations. There's a woman who I just did an interview for called If You Heard What I Heard, and it's all third generation survivors telling the stories of their grandparents. And she put me in touch with a whole slew of organizations that you can easily just go online, fill out a query, put your name in that you know, that like maybe try a couple different spellings, the name of a hometown, and you just see what you get, because there are really so many places. So yes, go. I won't bore you with all the URLs and the names, but yes, there's museums in the States, the International Tracing Service, Shoah Foundation. There's so many, and they're all on my website. It's a great question.
This is terrific.
Thank you.
I think you get a pretty good sense of the enthusiasm and response to your work.
Thank you.
In your other showings, so to speak, do you get this kind of response? Have you been in any European venues at all yourself on a program like this at all?
No, I haven't done a book talk in Europe yet, but what I have done a lot of, which has been like really fun for me recently, is school talks. A couple of schools have incorporated the book into their curriculum, and I get to meet with high school kids and talk, and I have a very like a kind of a different presentation. It really goes from research finding to how it came to life, that piece of research on the pages of the book, to how it then came to life in the script, to how it looks on the screen. So I've been having a lot of meaningful conversations with students who are really reacting so beautifully to it. But no, you guys have been an amazing audience. I really appreciate your energy.
That's really terrific, and I'm so glad that you're here. I want to thank Ava for making the connection, and obviously we're very happy that you came.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We have the book signing table here. So for those of you who have a book that would like it signed, by all means. And thank you all for coming, and to be continued.
Thank you.